Let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike.
This is preeminently the time to speak the truth, the whole truth, frankly and boldly.
History doesn't have to be boring, buttoned up, or inaccessible. And it certainly didn't end in 1945. It belongs to all of us, and we share and add to it every day. Welcome to the History A Go-Go podcast, where I interview interesting guests, cover a motley crew of topics, and it's a place where you can sit, think, and drink all at the same time. I'm your host, Rob Mellon. Welcome. My guest today is Mark Twain expert Terrell Dempsey. His book, Searching for Jim, Slavery in Sam Clemens' World, is the untold story of Sam Clemens and the slave culture in Missouri that produced him. Terrell is a practicing attorney at the law firm of Dempsey and Dempsey and a professed accidental historian. He is a member of the board of directors of the Friends of the Dr. Richard Eells House in Quincy, Illinois, which was the first underground railroad station across the border of Missouri, which was a slave state at the time. Today, we will discuss slavery in America's hometown and how that affected Mark Twain. Welcome, accidental historian Terrell Dempsey.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you very much. Well, it's tradition here, Terrell, to accompany the conversation with a special brew. In honor of Samuel Langhorne Clemens, we have the appropriate Tom Sawyer's Blonde Ale from the Mark Twain Brewing Company in Hannibal, Missouri. You could stop by their brew pub at 422 North Main Street in Hannibal, get something to eat, and enjoy a Tom Sawyer for yourself. Remember, you can suggest a feature beer for a future episode. Just subscribe to the podcast wherever you get your podcast, leave a review, or like our Facebook page and leave a comment. If I can pay you a compliment, your book is incredibly well written. And
didn't know a lawyer could do that, did
yeah,
you?
Right. It's easy to read, especially for, as you said, a lawyer and an accidental historian, but it is really easy to read. I'm guessing the title of your book kind of explains why you became a historian in the first place. Could you describe your search for Jim and Sam Clemens' world, which was steeped in the slave culture of that day?
Well, I would assume that anybody who would listen to this show knows that Hannibal, Missouri is 110% immersed in Mark Twain and Mark Twainiana. However, the community had chosen a long time ago to portray themselves as characters from Tom Sawyer, which was Mark Twain's juvenile book. Tom Sawyer was a children's book. And so the characters in the community were immersed totally in this Tom Sawyer story. And it just became obvious to me that Jim was missing. And I went out looking for the story of slavery because Hannibal had completely hidden its slave history, didn't talk about slavery. And it was very, very ironic because the Mark Twain scholars of the world probably they consider Huckleberry Finn to be his masterpiece. In fact, you can start an argument about this, but if you get together with a bunch of history professors, most of them will tell you that's the greatest American novel. And, of course, its central theme is slavery and Jim running away from this slave community. And so I started out looking for slavery in Hannibal, and there was just nothing about it. I mean, zero, nothing. And would you like to, can I talk about my personal motivation for this?
Absolutely.
Well, and by the way, this is very personal, but my wife and I, my wife's 5'10" blonde, blue-eyed German girl from St. Louis. I mean, everybody in her family up to this generation was descended from German Lutherans who settled in St. Louis in the 19th century. And my family's been here since the 17th century, but very, very, very white. And anyway, we couldn't have children. And we adopted 2 little girls through the Division of Family Services, and didn't go out looking for this. We just needed children, and met these 2 little kids. And once I met them, there was no way I wasn't going to bring them home with me to live. You know, it was just like meeting a puppy. You got to have them. So we adopted 2 little girls. They were 4 and 6, and they're mixed race. And so it was very, very obvious that people of color get treated differently than white people. So you kind of get this thrown in your face a lot. And there's a rite of passage in Hannibal, and that is 7th grade. The kids all study Mark Twain, and they read Tom Sawyer. And there's a competition in town to select a Tom and Becky. And Tom and Becky are the ambassadors for the community. They're cute little, 13-year-old boy and girl. They serve for a year. They some of them have traveled internationally promoting Hannibal, and they meet the boats when they come to town. And if the president or vice president visits, or some other dignitary, they're the people that go. And they have a competition to select the Tom and Becky. Well, it just became very obvious to me that my girls didn't qualify for Becky. And that probably motivated me more than anything to go out and start looking, because really they just did the Tom Sawyer story, and it left my kids out. And just through some wonderful happenstance, I tumbled upon, there was a newspaper editor had stashed a whole bunch of Hannibal newspapers from the 1840s and 50s, and a minister in town discovered them in the 1920s and gave them to the Historical Society. And it just turned out to be a treasure trove of information about the slave dealers in Hannibal, and the type of lives that slaves led, and how slaves were treated. And I tumbled onto that. Well, I just knew immediately when I found that I had this wonderful source. And then I spent about 5 years doing research. This is back in the days before computer-assisted research. And these newspapers had all been put on microfilm by the State Historical Society, and the Hannibal Library hadn't had a copy. And boggles my brain that no other scholar had ever gotten in there and worked with them, but they hadn't. And so it cost me a quarter a page every time I found an article on slavery. Cost me a quarter page to print out the microfilm so I could take it home and work with it. Literally copied thousands of pages like that, and ended up hiring some young students to help me. And wow, was there a huge story there, just a huge story. And got a lot of interest nationally because the Mark Twain scholars just craving information on, how Twain developed and what was in his interaction with slaves. And it was very different from what he kind of led the world to believe.
So what was that story of his boyhood, his connection? I know from your book he had an uncle
Right.
Quarles.
Right, John Quarles, who lived out in Rawls County. And And in fact, I start my book talking about, he described it as a plantation and said that John had 40 to 50 slaves. Well, Mark Twain did what Mark Twain always did, and that was engage in comic hyperbole, because Uncle John Quarles had a 240-acre farm, and he just had a handful of slaves at any given time.
So when he said plantation, it was almost in quotations, like sarcastically.
I just think he was trying to intentionally conflate
Okay.
to make the public believe it was a plantation. The moss hanging from the oaks on the long alley leading up to the huge White House with the slave quarters out back. And that wasn't what it was. It was a very modest farmhouse and just a simple little Missouri farm and just a handful of slaves. I really don't remember exactly how many there were in the censuses, but I want to say it was something between 7 and a dozen total, and that was all ages. Oh, I'm sorry. John Quarles had 6 slaves in 1840 and 11 in 1850.
So Missouri was a slave state and had developed into a slave state because of the migration that occurred in Missouri. But when you look at Hannibal specifically, or Marion County and Rawls County, and then across, I guess, the central part of Missouri also, how vibrant was slavery during that time period when Mark Twain or Samuel Clemens was growing up?
Well, it was extremely common. The 1850 census, about 24% of the population of Marion County was slaves. But you have to remember that the highways were the rivers, okay? So the people that came to settle in Missouri, and Missouri came into the Union as a slave state. You remember the Missouri Compromise. Maine gets carved off and comes in as a free state, and Missouri comes in as a slave state. And, of course, it's a really bizarre arrangement because Missouri is just, by design, supposed to be a peninsula of slavery sticking up into free territory, because part of the Missouri Compromise said no other state north of that line, 36 degrees, 30 minutes north, which runs just right down there in the Arkansas border, no other territory, all the way out to California, nothing north of that is supposed to be slave territory. That was part of the Missouri Compromise. So you had this sore thumb of slavery sticking up into free territory here in Missouri. And the lots of slaves, and you're correct, because people, when they migrated, came by river. The land alongside the Mississippi River and the Missouri River is populated first, and so it goes east from the Mississippi and north and south from the Missouri River. So if you look at, again, like a map showing population density in 1860, northern Missouri and southern Missouri are pretty sparsely populated, and the bulk of the population's there in that belt across the state and on the eastern side of the state.
So what was the slavery tradition in the Clemens family specifically?
Well, John Marshall Clemens and Jane Clemens really could have been poster children for American slaveholders. They owned or acquired slaves in every fashion imaginable. They both inherited slaves. They bought and sold the slaves, on at least one on investment. John Marshall Clemens sued somebody, got a judgment against them. And when you get a judgment, that's just a piece of paper saying somebody else owes you property. And so he went and executed and seized a 9-year-old slave girl and had her sold at public auction. In addition, when John Marshall Clemens was a lousy businessman. In fact, he took bankruptcy before he died. But even after as things went downhill, they would sell the slaves for cash. And even after they'd sold all their slaves, they still leased slaves to work in the household. I mean, you always had a domestic slave, because you have to remember, in Missouri, you really didn't have any single labor-intensive crop like cotton or tobacco or sugar. So we didn't really, there's some exceptions to this down in Howard County, down around Fayette, Missouri, that area. There were some hemp farms down there that would function like what people generally think of as slave labor. But the way you made money off slaves in northeast Missouri primarily was by renting them out to other people. Or you could exploit their labor yourself. If you had a mill, you would buy a couple of slaves to work in your mill. If you were tanning leather, you could buy slaves to work in your tannery. And that's true of any type of labor-intensive business, and this is the 19th century on the frontier in Missouri in the 1840s anyway. So everything was pretty labor-intensive. But the way you made money off your slaves was leasing them out to other people. And a very common thing was domestic servants. And one of the things that really shocked me when I was doing the research is there was actually a preference for young children as domestic servants. I mean, so you'd see kids 7, 8, 9, and 10 being rented out to work as household servants.
Was that they could control them a little easier?
Control them. The males, they're not sexually threatening. Just
there's a whole host of reasons.
Right, a whole host of reasons. And they're doing things like, this before indoor plumbing, so you had the night soil. The chamber pots had to be emptied in the morning, and nobody wanted to do that. You had to clean out the ash out of the wood stove and start the fire in the morning. There were just a lot of onerous, nasty tasks that it was very, very nice to have somebody around that you could just, tell to do those things. And that's where the money was in slavery in northeast Missouri. And slavery was extremely common. They've kind of minimized it over the years, and the way they did it, historians would say, well, only 7% of people owned slaves, but families owned slaves, okay? And when you look at the actual numbers, it was like 40% of the families owned slaves, and then they're leasing them out to all these other people. And an analogy I come up with is having a slave in your household in the 1840s and 50s in northeast Missouri was probably as common as people having an electric, an automatic dishwasher in your house today. You don't have to be too wealthy to have a dishwasher. You didn't have to be very wealthy to lease a slave by the year.
Well, John Marshall Clemens is a good example of that, because your book details how he's pretty much a failure in almost all of his business dealings, as you mentioned.
It flopped,
And he owned slaves, which is not normally the narrative. The narrative is very few percent of the people in the slave states owned slaves. 20%. You said 7, but the reality is he owned slaves.
And again, the fact that you didn't own slaves didn't mean you didn't have slaves, because they were very inexpensive to lease, very inexpensive.
So you mentioned that Missouri is that peninsula of slavery surrounded by free states or territories, and they have a dispute. They have disputes in Iowa. And then, of course, in this area, right across the river and not too far away, is Quincy. And Quincy has a relatively vibrant anti-slavery society. Could you speak about the that juxtaposed position between the slavery in northeast Missouri and then a relatively vibrant anti-slavery society in west central Illinois?
Well, before I do that, and I'll get back to your question, so write it down, but before I do that, I want to say this creates a bit of a poor impression, because you need to understand, your listeners need to understand, that we were a slaveholding nation. And the fact that the Northwest Territory, for example, where slaveholding is prohibited, you can't live there and own slaves, did not mean that there were not slaves present in all those free states. There would have always been migrants coming out on the national road, walking through with their slaves. There would have been always slaves going up and down the river, working on those boats that would stop in Quincy. If the slaveholder spent a night in a hotel, it was very common for the hotel to lock slaves up as a courtesy for their slave-owning guests. If you needed a slave disciplined and you were passing through Illinois, you could pay the sheriff to whip your slave. If your slave ran off, the local law enforcement people would be glad to retrieve the slave for you and help you retrieve your slave. So I don't want to, one of the things I'm most concerned about is there's this huge myth about what it meant to be a free state versus what it meant to be a slave state.
Well, and not only that, even if you take Quincy, for example, the vast majority of Quincyans at the time would not have considered themselves anti-slavery, even though there was a pocket of anti-slavery activity.
That's very true. And really, you have to look at the timeline. You have to realize that prior to 1833, there was no place for a runaway slave to go. I mean, you could go hide out, but Canada didn't abolish slavery until 1833. And we were a very homogenous culture. And free state meant you're not supposed to, for instance, you were not supposed to live in Illinois and own slaves. Not supposed to. There were people who did, okay? But you were not supposed to do that. And this was respected by Missouri. In fact, it's very interesting. You know, the Dred Scott case. The prior case, prior to Dred Scott, was a case called Rachel v. Walker. And it was almost the exact same facts as Dred Scott. Rachel had been a slave of a soldier who was placed, I'm sorry, you're a military person, you'll know this better. He was posted, her owner was posted to a fort in the Northwest Territory, and he took Rachel with him to live there. And she sued for her freedom in a Missouri court and won because the Missouri court said very clearly, nope, Northwest Territory says you can't reside there and own slaves. If you went there and you resided there, regardless of why you resided there, his argument was, I was, sent there by the military. Rachel was freed by Missouri courts. So there was pretty homogenous sentiment and law regarding slavery prior to late 1830s. And, of course, that changed because Dred Scott said the exact same facts. In fact, I often wonder, when Dred Scott first went in, to hire an attorney for his freedom suit, I know they just thought it was going to be a cakewalk because it was exactly the same facts. And in the law, we follow what you're supposed to follow precedent. You're supposed to get the same deal as the last person in front of you got. And, of course, there have been changes on the composition of the Missouri Supreme Court and changes on the composition of the United States Supreme Court. And, of course, the Dred Scott case just blows the whole thing out of the water. Once again, makes the entire nation a slave-owning case, a slave-owning nation, because it says your property is your property and take it anywhere. But when we're talking about when the anti-slavery societies are started here in Quincy, it was a minority position. There were huge pro-slavery rallies in Quincy. Anytime there was runaway slaves coming through Quincy, the Quincy merchants, they liked selling goods to those people in Missouri. And there were all sorts of people settled in Missouri. If you've ever gone over to Lincoln's New Salem, all those people were from Kentucky. They weren't radical New England abolitionists. There were a lot of people here in Illinois, from Virginia and Kentucky that, they abided by the rules. You're not supposed to live here and own slaves, but they weren't by any stretch of the imagination anti-slavery. So there was, and it started in the 1830s, and it was really almost a religious movement.
Right, I was going to bring that up, because in your book you do you do a really good job of actually breaking it down by denomination. So if you can describe that a little bit.
Well, probably the people with the greatest impact around here were the Presbyterians. And I'm not going to purport to understand the difference between Congregationalists and Presbyterians. Those are the two major religious Protestant groups that were here at that time. The Catholics weren't here yet in number. There were Catholics here, but not in any kind of number. And but they were primarily had to do with how you organized your congregations and your the greater religious body. But the Presbyterians have these general assemblies, and there was a thing going on called the Second Great Awakening. It was a time of intensive religious revival, and people were really wanting to bring about the kingdom of God on earth, which is a common Christian goal. And it was kind of oriented towards doing good works. And so you have things like prison reform and the early proto-feminism comes out of this, women's suffrage. And one of the things was people started looking at slavery and said, this is a bad thing. And there were all these different strains of people who were concerned about the negative impact of slavery. And not everyone was concerned about the well-being of the slaves. Many people were concerned about what slavery did to white people. It makes our children into martinets. It makes us lazy and not productive. Kind of like you can get up and get your own cup of tea, that type of philosophy. Other people, were really troubled by treating other human beings in this fashion and recognize the humanity of African slaves. And so there's this large gamut of people. But one of the folks who had been converted by Theodore Weld, who was like the giant spark plug for this radical abolitionism, was David Nelson. And Nelson was in Missouri organizing Presbyterian churches. And really, if you live on the river in northeast Missouri, David Nelson started the first Presbyterian church in your community. Canton and Hannibal, Louisiana, and down into St. Louis. And David Nelson just all on fire about abolitionism. And, of course, one of the people he converted was Elijah Lovejoy. Elijah Lovejoy, of course, goes on to be martyred down in Alton, Illinois, but at the time he meets David Nelson, I think it was 36, Elijah Lovejoy is running a Presbyterian newspaper in St. Charles, Missouri, I think St. Louis Observer. And really he's writing about primarily, and I know this will cause hurt feelings in Quincy, especially Quincy, Illinois, is such a Catholic community, but really it's more anti-Catholic than anything else. They were very concerned about these papists coming over, and changing America. And that's what the St. Louis Observer had been. And then Elijah Lovejoy is converted by David Nelson and starts taking up the issue of slavery is not as anti-Christian, and we should free our slaves. And he gets thrust to the limelight when, and this fascinates me, how Missouri's always been at the forefront of these things. You know, we talked about the Dred Scott case. There was a young man named Francis McIntosh, who was in the terms of that time, a mulatto, a mixed race guy, who got arrested for fighting on the riverfront in St. Louis. And two deputies are walking along, and McIntosh says, "Well, what's going to happen to me?" And one of the deputies, just joking, says, "Man, we're probably going to hang you." And McIntosh freaks out, gets a knife out, slashes the throat of one of the deputies, tries to run off. Of course, he gets caught, and then he's captured, and a mob comes, gets him released from jail, ties him up, and burns him to death. I mean, a very, very gruesome way to die. And anybody is there in the mob. I mean, nobody bothers to hood up or anything like that, like they do in the Klan years later. And so all these civic leaders were there, and everybody knew who exactly was there. And so the prosecuting attorney decides to prosecute, and the judge rules that it's the action of the mob is just like the people going to the polls and voting. And Elijah Lovejoy just picks up this cause, and that's how he ends up getting run out of Missouri over at Alton. And he writes about McIntosh and what a horrible thing it was. And, it's just exactly like Michael Brown, all these many years later, getting killed by the cop in St. Louis. So David Nelson is the big abolitionist in this area. He gets run out of Missouri. In 1836, he's caught with abolitionist literature. He had a school over near Philadelphia, Missouri. They run him out of Missouri, and he came over to Quincy. And in Quincy, he started a school along with several other people. One of them, Dr. Eells, and called the Mission Institute. And the Mission Institute, their purpose was to prepare what was called home missionaries. We think in terms today of missionaries going to other countries and working, and they certainly had those type of missionaries as well. But they were preparing missionaries to work, again, part of the Second Great Awakening. We're going to make this a better society, both among people in the United States and also among Native Americans. And the little Mission Institute, they owned 3 or 4 pieces of land in Quincy. There was one little cluster of buildings where they lived was over on between 24th and 25th on Prentice, back between Broadway and Main Street there in Quincy. And then the other was out back behind David Nelson's house, which is still standing, but where Lowe's and the Veterans Clinic is now, that out in that area was where another clump of houses. And these students built their own houses and raised their own food, but they became very active in the anti-slavery movement. And you're right when you say that they were very, very active in Quincy. However, I have no real number to throw out at you because nobody ever did a poll, but it was definitely a minority position.
Well, it is a minority, but what it does is it gives, and you describe some of the other circumstances that happen in the country, like a destination to go to. immediately, which is across the river. Obviously, they're not going to stay there. Their destination is much further north, Chicago or Canada. But what it does, even though they're a minority, it gives them a destination.
Yes and no. You didn't run up a flag that says, come here, runaway slaves. The big problem that the people at the Mission Institute had in the early 1840s is that
they can't. You actually do a really good job of this in your book. You describe how they want to help, but the river's in the way and the law's in the way.
The river's in the way, the law's in the way, and the slaves don't know that you exist.
So they got to fix that. They got to try to fix that. And you actually describe that there are three characters that try to solve that issue that they have with Thompson, Work, and Burr. Can you describe what happens with those three characters?
Well, Thompson, Work, and Burr were fascinating individuals. Two of them were students, Allen Work and George Thompson. And one of them was a mechanic, which I think just means he did upkeeping things on buildings. And they got tired of waiting for slaves to come to them. And it's really unclear whether there were many, if any, slaves who came to them. We really don't know. It's lost in myth. There's no real documentation that establishes what, if any, runaway slaves came through Quincy prior to Thompson, Work, and Burr. But they decided to go over into Missouri. They literally paddled a boat over, and one guy stayed in the boat, and two guys went, and just walking around, walked up to slaves in the fields and said, "Hi, we're here to take you to freedom." And we believe that there had been at least one trip before the one where they get caught, and they had successfully lured somebody off. But they ended up getting caught because they went up to a group of slaves that were working and said, "Hi, we're here to take you to freedom." And the slaves had no idea that there was such a thing as abolitionists. Didn't know anything about Canada. Nobody ever came to them and said, "Hey, guess what? Canada abolished slavery in 1833 when the British Empire did away with it." And so when these guys came up to them and talked to them as equals, which was something that, white people didn't do in Missouri in any slave state, as a slave, you think in terms of, a domesticated animal almost. So when Thompson and when they came up to them in the field and spoke to them, they listened to what they had to say, and they said, if you want to go to freedom, meet us here. And they mentioned an abandoned house, and we'll row you across the river to freedom. And when they left, the slaves got together and talked among themselves, and they came to the only logical conclusion they could reach. They knew they had value, and they decided that these were slave thieves. And because they just couldn't envision anybody being charitable enough to want to come off and really improve their life and take them away. And they turned them in. They went to one of the guys who owned several of the slaves, and some of them were leased. We talked about leased slaves. But they selected a slave named Anthony to kind of be the spokesman for the group, and he went and told them, well, the white folks knew about the abolitionists. They could read and write and had access to newspapers, and they knew about David Nelson and the Mission Institute. And so they set up a trap got together a posse, a group of white men, and they were armed, but they had a problem. And the problem was a black person couldn't testify in court against a white person in Missouri. Couldn't do it. I mean, just not to beat this analogy to death, but just like a dog can't testify in court. These were not people, they're property, and they're not competent witnesses. So what they did was taught Anthony questions to ask the guys very loudly so that the white guys who were lying and waiting could hear, because they'd have to testify in court. And so on it was a Saturday night in July of 1841. They literally went and met him, and very loudly, well, where are we going? Well, we're going to take you to, we're going to get you to Canada. We're going to take you across the river, and it was just horrible. How are we going to do it? Well, we're going to got to rowboat and row across the river, and where are we going to go? We're going to go to the Mission Institute. And then, after they'd said enough, the white guys jump out and, cock their guns and trap them. They go down, and it was, I think Thompson was the guy at the boat, and they go down to the waterfront, and Thompson's there in the boat. He sees the black guys coming. He doesn't realize that his friends that Burr and Work have been caught, and they arrest him. It was kind of pathetic. He's going, come on, get in, let's go. Once he figures out that there are white people nearby, and they arrested all three of them. And they got 12-year sentences in prison.
That's the one thing that struck me, was the severity of the punishment for what they were charged for. And Mark Twain's father was involved in that case.
Yeah, he was on the jury. Yeah, this is really interesting. Nowadays we try very, very hard to get this jury that looks like the community. Well, I can talk for hours about how they exclude black people from juries in Northeast Missouri, but theoretically, we're supposed to have a jury that looks like the community. And they didn't. You couldn't even use the phone book, because only rich people had phone books. When you put jury panels together. But in the 19th century, they used to have what they called blue ribbon juries, and the judge would just have the sheriff go out and get respected people from the community. And so they went, and John Marshall Clemens was one of the guys who was on the jury that convicted Thompson, Work, and Burr. It was really interesting, though. There were some important things that happened. The jail in Palmyra, one, they didn't hurt these guys. They didn't, I think they got a trial. They didn't lynch them. But they kept them in jail, and they were kind of they were an oddity, and people came to see them, but one night, and this was a very critical event in the history of Underground Railroad in Missouri, a slave came to the window where they were and apologized to them, and basically told them that nobody had any idea that slaves didn't understand that there were white people who were wanting to help slaves run away. And so I think one really, really great unintended consequence was they made this great sacrifice. They go to prison. But it alerted the slave community, and they communicated to the fact that there were abolitionists they existed and that there were people who were willing to take risks and try to help you get away.
So even though it was unsuccessful, it kind of laid the groundwork for situations later.
And it did something else, too, because, and that is this, whenever a slave ran away in northeast Missouri, it was a bit like that scene in Casablanca, where they say, let's round up the usual suspects. Whenever a slave ran away in northeast Missouri, the slave owners never believed that a slave was capable of doing that on their own. They believed that it was outside agitators, the same nonsense that we heard in the civil rights movement. You can hear it nowadays when they're talking about civil unrest going on in communities around the United States. What's outside agitators coming here and doing it? The slaveholding community, the slave culture, as I call it, in northeast Missouri, believed that their slaves were loyal. How did we find out about this? Well, Anthony the slave came and told us. And so they were very, very vigilant. It's kind of hard to be a traveling salesperson or an itinerant, a Methodist minister, riding the circuit, because they look at you like you're not here to run off slaves. And so my thinking, and I've done a lot more research on this since I wrote Searching for Jim too. My thinking is that most what we call Underground Railroad activity in northeast Missouri was African Americans helping other African Americans, and the white assistance, which had been very real and took place, was on the Illinois side of the river, and I don't think most of it was terribly well organized. When I think of Underground Railroad, I think about connections between people, not so much place. It's people and their relations to one another. But, if you were a runaway slave, you wouldn't go up to a white person in Missouri and look for assistance, but you would go to another black person. And that slave may not be able to do anything other than, give you a place to hide for the night, maybe get you a little cornbread or something. But they could point you whatever they knew. They had pretty small worlds. Interestingly, there was no law at this time against teaching slaves to read. That comes later. But most slaves were kept in the dark. A lot of the things that, old stereotypes about, black people being afraid of cemeteries and ghosts. They were taught that by white people as a control mechanism, so they wouldn't go out. There's still the notion today of black people not swimming. Well, hell, you didn't teach slaves to swim. You didn't let them go swimming. You didn't want them to get the idea of swimming across the. The Mississippi River is a big thing to swim across, but is it the Des Moines River up north here? That's a very, very small river to swim across.
Yeah, the Mississippi River would have been treacherous. You mentioned that in your book too. That the runaway situation was dangerous in itself.
Extreme.
It was, So, and I did have a question. Comparing the Missouri slave system, if we go to the punishments which you go through in your book, how did they differ? Were they virtually the same in the Deep South, say in Mississippi and Alabama, to the Missouri slave codes?
Well, the honest answer to this question is I'm not an expert on plantation slavery. Okay, I really don't know as to what the differences would be. My suspicion would be that they're identical, and the punishment there were just all sorts of horrid things that people did. Including
Samuel Clemens' father.
Right. treating slaves. I mean, in my book, I have, somebody having hot jam thrown on them. Sam Clemens' dad, Jane has him come home and beat the slave. They tie you up by your wrists and beat you with a belt. They could send you to the sheriff with a note, and a coin, and the note, of course, the slave can't read. The note says, give this guy 10 lashes. There was smoking, where they would tie you up by your hands in the smokehouse. And sometimes they would put notches, put tobacco or something, not just the little fire which they smoked meats with. It just depends on how cruel, I guess,
the individual was.
Master would be.
Right. I mean, that's generally when I studied slave societies and plantation system, it was really dependent on the individual, that you would have some benevolent type of slave masters, and then you would have others who were more cruel, knowing that at the same time it is property. So you want to send a message, but at the same time you don't want to hurt your production and the value of your property as well.
It depends how sadistic somebody was. It depends how angry somebody was.
Yeah, there's no question about that, because if someone's angry, they can do damage even to their own property, and I'm sure that was the case in the slave society as well.
A lot of rape, and not just heterosexual, but I mean just a lot of really hideous things were done.
And in your book, I think you mentioned that that's almost worse than the punishments that were inflicted. I mean, it's pretty scary thought that those things occurred. And
it's dehumanization is at the very core of slavery. I mean, you have to dehumanize the person to make them a commodity, because if they're not a commodity, if they're not a thing instead of a person, you can't do these things to them. You can't sell them. You can't separate them. And of course, slave culture wrapped themselves in myths. They wanted to believe that they were kind and, loving patriarchs. And, but, there were just a lot of hard-headed business people. And, when the stuff hit the fan, you had to do what you do. Like the Clemenses, I mean, they sold all their slaves. They didn't own any slaves at the end. The only slaves that Jane Clemens had around were ones that she leased, children that she leased.
So Samuel Clemens has this, I guess, epiphany or something later, because he grows up in this slave system.
He marries into a family of abolitionists, and he becomes friends with the Beechers, and it's complicated. He was a very bright, intelligent guy. I think
it's so nuanced, because there's all kinds of it. There's the straight abolitionist, and even in the abolitionist, there's individuals who are more radical than others. You have the colonist, those who are colonizationists, who think that they need to be colonized, which definitely has an underpinning of racism and white superiority based in it as well. And then you have those who think they just need to be emancipated. So there's variations in all of this. And I can tell you from our research that we do at the Historical Society, we're doing some stuff for the Woodland Cemetery tours, and we're going to focus on some of these individuals like David Nelson. Some of them were against slavery their whole life, but never wanted to be considered an abolitionist in any way, shape, or form.
Well, I look, racism is this beast that America struggled with from the get-go. And, I touched on this earlier when I'm talking about a lot of anti-slavery sentiment was based on the idea that it's bad for us as white people. Seriously, you'll read literature about, the children of slaveholders become martinets, they become lazy, they don't have the values that we look for, so we need to get rid of slavery so that we will be better people. And that's the American Colonization Society, Henry Clay and the Whigs were very, very big in this. And by the way, especially prior to, I'll just randomly pick 1850. Prior to 1850, there were colonization societies in slave states. And it was certainly, there was nothing wrong with, you could rent a hall in mid-1840s in South Carolina and give a talk on we should eliminate slavery because it's bad for us, and I'm going to talk about why it is. And you wouldn't get run out of town. Now, 10 years later, you'd been tarred and feathered.
Well, things just get it just gets so much more intense over time. You mentioned going back, to the time.
Criticize the institution.
Yeah, and then you have situations like the Dr. Eells situation, and then just more of those circumstances. That's local, but those happen throughout these bordering regions. And then you have the situation you mentioned with the slave bin and the murders in Marion County, which in that case is a true situation where you have a horrible person who happens to be a slave do horrendous things, and then that's used to justify all of the aspects of the the rules against slaves and the slave code in general.
Well, there's this whole. It's so complicated because there are all these images and myths about slaves and black people. This whole idea that they're sexual beasts, that they want white women, and that's what Ben murdered.
Could you describe what happens in that circumstance? And then it's no question that justifies it.
There's an upside to the Ben story, too. I mean, the upside to Ben is they didn't just take it out and lynch him. It wasn't a McIntosh situation.
That's no question. I was surprised.
Got a fair trial, gave a little talk on the scaffold before they hanged him, repented. And by the way, I don't think anybody questions whether or not he did it. But there was a little girl and her brother were out gathering nuts, and Ben was doing some work. Interesting, slaves were not necessarily monitored 24/7. I've had some people say some really goofy things to me, like, there's a barn over there and it's got the pins and rings in the wall where they change the slaves up every night. Well, slaves didn't get chained up every night. You get pretty tight social controls in place. But Ben was doing some labor, and he slipped off and he murdered a little boy, Susan, the little girl that was. He raped her and murdered her, and
then sliced her up with a knife, I think.
Yeah, I cut her nose off. It really disfigured her. And it's kind of hard. You want to speculate about the rage that a slave might have from the mistreatment he's received over the years, but we don't know. We have no idea, what motivated him to do this.
But there's no question that depiction of the dangerous slave,
right?
That is an example, and then those things scare.
That scares everybody. The only thing scarier than that is the slave revolt. And we actually had something that came close to that in 1849, late 40. In fact, it was about the same time as Ben. A group of slaves that belonged to 4 different families in Lewis County got together, got some guns and wagons, and were going to run off together. And the white folks tumbled onto what was happening and surrounded them. And one guy kind of did the kamikaze thing. He ran at them with I forget what he had, a hay knife and a hatchet or something in his hand, and just charged the white people, and they just blew him away. But you had that happen at about the same time as Ben, and man, it just locked down. It was a huge change in Northeast Missouri prior to 1850. You know, that when I describe that world, you know, I'm talking about in the 1830s when, you know, you could take your slaves into Missouri, and, you know, we all kind of thought the same. We really started dividing up into slave free. And after 1849, no way you could rent a hall and come into Hannibal or Canton and talk about, you know, we need to do away with slavery, because you either were for it or you were against it. And it really, and I'm not saying that those sentiments might not have existed. You might have been able to have a civil conversation, but seriously, you couldn't rent a hall. And you never hear about the Colonization Society in Northeast Missouri again after that time. It disappears. And it had chapters. It was a chapter in Hannibal. And even though they just wanted a gradual compensated emancipation, you know, they weren't saying let's, you know, free all the slaves tomorrow. It was, well, we'll pass a law and, you know, we'll set them free when they reach age 25 or 40 or whatever. I mean, thousands of different ideas like this. But after Ben, after this attempted mass escape in Lewis County, the legislatures pass all kinds of bills. You know, you can't teach a slave to read. You know, you can't leave an unattended boat. You have to chain it up if you got a boat on the river, lock it. And there's slave patrols. Of course, slave patrols were organized a little earlier in the 1840s, but they become more organized. And, you know, there's a sign up at the ferry crossings, you know, warning abolitionists that they'll be, you know, they're not welcome and will be pursued. And it really starts locking down into 2 very different cultures. And the churches, which, you know, again, had been relatively out of the fray, they start dividing up. You know, the Methodist Church splits into the ME North and the ME South, the ME South being pro-slavery. The Southern Baptist Convention comes into existence because they believe that, you know, slavery it's not just economic necessity, it's a good and holy thing that God intended for us. And really nearly all the Protestant churches split up. The Catholic Church did not. The Episcopal Church did not. The theology of slavery that arises is just kind of mind-boggling. You know, of course, they would preach a lot on, you know, that letter, Philemon, Paul's letter, you know, where he admonished the slave to go back to his master. And then they had this theory that slaves were descended from Ham.
Right. You mentioned the curse of Ham.
Yeah. Well, it really was something that was preached and believed, though. Anyway, it's just fascinating. But that all just really came about in that decade or so before the Civil War. I'll say in the 1840s and 50s.
And this is a time that forms Samuel Clemens. I mean, he's living up and growing up during all of these
Exactly.
events and these changing parts of society. How does it form him? Like when you did your research and you finally get to tying it back to Samuel Clemens, who doesn't refer to himself as Mark Twain, the pseudonym Mark Twain, until I think 1863. But how does that form him?
Well, I think Sam Clemens, we know, was very pro-slavery. He wrote back when he left and went to New York for the first time, writes back how strange it is to see, black people on the streets. And he certainly always had slaves. He was apprenticed to Joseph Amott when he was about, I think he was 12, by his mom. They were very, very poor. By the way, the Mark Twain house there in Hannibal, was full of all this really, really expensive furniture that she never had anything like that. She was running a boarding house, basically, and the boys, at one point, Orion is operating the newspaper out of the room. They got fixed up as a fancy parlor. But she's poor, and she farms Sam Clemens out to Joseph Amott, and that's where he learns to set type and work on the newspaper. But one of the indignities that he had to live with was he ate with the slaves while he was doing that, and he was sleeping on the floor, the second floor of the building. But one of the things that I thought was fascinating, I write about this in the book. Evidently, an S.C. Clemens wrote a letter saying he'd just been released from prison because he was an abolitionist. Can you send me money to live on to the Boston Aid Society? And the abolitionists sent him some money, and virtually certain that was Sam Clemens ripping off the abolitionists, and that would have been a funny joke to him, of course, and would have got him some money.
Well, when the war starts, when secession starts, he's called up with, I believe the governor of Missouri is Jackson, and he's called up with the militia, the state militia. He's not a true Confederate. That in your book, I think you indicate that he was never a true Confederate. But what it does is it creates a situation where once the war starts, he probably needs to get out of Missouri.
Well, there's nothing more fascinating than Samuel Clemens in the Civil War, because when the shooting actually starts, Sam Clemens was a pilot on the Mississippi, and if he wasn't on the very last boat that came through before the Union shut the river down, he was on one of the last boats that came through. And he's in St. Louis, and they actually tried to recruit him to be one of the pilots that took the federal troops, Nathaniel Lyon, and the federal troops by boat up the Missouri River to Boonville, pursuing Claiborne Fox Jackson and the Missouri State militia. And he actually went and talked to the Union military and then slipped out of town, came back up to Hannibal. We don't know exactly what he did, but here's what was going on at the time. It was very confusing. If you were over 18 and a healthy male, you were by law part of the state militia and could be called up at any time. And Claiborne Fox Jackson, in response to Lincoln asking for Missouri to provide 50,000 troops to help put down the rebellion, refused to do that, had a conference with Nathaniel Lyon at the Planters Hotel in St. Louis, just completely falls apart, and Jackson goes back to Jeff City by railroad, burning the bridges behind him. But he issues a call for the Missouri State Militia go into camp. And it was a really confusing time because the Missouri State Militia, the state government had not seceded from the Union. Okay. And they took an oath of allegiance to both the Constitution of the state of Missouri and the United States Constitution. So they were not in any fashion Confederates. Now, there were a lot of people there with Confederate sympathies, but a lot of people came out in response to that call. And it appears that Samuel Clemens may have gone out with a group that organized in Rawls County. Now, no one ever got shot. You know, I tell a private history of a campaign that failed. I can't, and nobody has ever found somebody who got shot the way somebody gets shot in that story. But Sam Clemens' brother Orion was actually the head of the Lincoln campaign for Northeast Missouri. Not a lot of people voted for Lincoln, but Orion was in charge of that. And Orion got a job as secretary to the governor of the territory of Nevada. And whatever Sam Clemens did, we're talking the summer of 1861 here. I think we're talking July. By August, he's out in Nevada with his brother, working as the unpaid secretary to the secretary. So I don't think Sam Clemens ever fought. He certainly never ever took any oath of allegiance to the Confederate government. It is confusing because he wrote that short story. And, you know, especially when he worked with Grant on his memoirs, I think he, you know, again, when he gave, you always have to read between the lines with Sam Clemens as to what he's saying. But obviously, if he were a real Confederate, he would not have wanted to been, you know, basically working for the Union government in Nevada, which is what he ended up doing. And Orion, his brother, big Lincoln supporter. So it's actually rather confusing what he did.
So we covered quite a bit of information, and the last thing I just want to ask you today is, your book is entitled "Searching for Jim." Did you find Jim?
Yeah, I think I did. I really do. I'm kind of proud of the book, and because there have been a lot of changes they made at the museum. There in Hannibal, for instance, they talk about slavery. You know, there's a sign now in the boyhood home where they talk about slave would have slept on the pallet on the floor. You know, that's because of my work. And there's a wonderful little museum in town called Jim's Journey. That's the story of the African American experience, the Black experience in Hannibal. Not just slavery, but you know, the up till today. And a wonderful woman by the name of Faye Damp runs that, or is in charge of it, I should say. And you know, I think I fleshed out what slavery was like. It was just an important part of the culture. Taxes on slaves, you know, paid for the local and state government. It was so very common. It was ubiquitous. And really, it's something people need to know more about. You know, I don't know how you can process even what's going on today with Black Lives Matter, for example, and the debates we're having about, you know, the nature of policing. If you don't know what slavery was really like, and I can tell you from having talked with thousands of people about this, most lay people don't have a clue. So I think I've found Jim, and, I think I've made a real contribution to the dialogue. I like to joke and tell people I'm a living legend among about 900 English professors around the world. but I think I found Jim. I think I know who Jim was.
I'd like to thank my guest today, Terrell Dempsey, for taking us into the fascinating world that Mark Twain grew up in, slave culture in Northeast Missouri. You can purchase Terrell's book, Searching for Jim, Slavery in Sam Clemens' World, at the History Shop. It's the gift shop at the History Museum on the Square in Quincy, or you can find it on Amazon and other online locations. The featured beer today was Tom Sawyer's Blonde Ale. It's brand new, and you can pick it up at the Mark Twain Brewing Company in Hannibal, Missouri. The music was provided by the band Bones Fork. It's available nearly everywhere music is sold online. Remember to subscribe to the podcast, like our Facebook page, and leave a review. Got a chance to win a gift card if you do that. Join us again next time when we talk, think, and drink on History A Go-Go.